Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery's Heritage Manager.
And I'm Charlotte Holmes. I am a volunteer with Physicians Gallery.
And I'm Olivia Howarth, and I'm also a volunteer with Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as Q. So what's your Q then, Charlotte?
My Q is quinine. We talked about juniper berries in J, so we had the gin there, and now I'm bringing the tonic with quinine. And I am unfortunately going to pronounce it the American way because I can't get it out of my head, and I can't say it the British way. And I know that's terrible to say, but quinine, I can't do it. So what is quinine? It's a bitter alkaloid found in cinchona bark, but the word has been used more generally to describe a drug containing that alkaloid and any of its derivatives. And cinchona is a genus of evergreen trees or shrubs with fragrant white or pink flowers, but it's the bark that is the real powerhouse of the plant for humans. Its early European names give some clue as to where it's indigenous to. It is often referred to as Jesuits bark, or more importantly, Peruvian bark. So yes, South America. The indigenous people of the region knew the medicinal properties of the cinchona bark, and at some point must have communicated this to the European colonists when they came over to South America to colonize it. The Europeans then brought the cinchona bark back with them, and it was used in powder form throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It was mostly used for fevers, almost exclusively used for fevers. And supposedly Oliver Cromwell refused to use it when he had a fever because he was such a staunch Protestant that he shunned its association with the Jesuits. The more I read about Oliver Cromwell, the more I think I would not want to have a beer with him. It was such an important medicine at the time that the 18th century Scottish surgeon James Lind said that every British naval soldier should receive a ration of cinchona bark. So it was that ubiquitous. Because historians like a good argument, there's some dispute about when quinine was isolated from the bark. The main theory, because it's the one that sort of creates the name quinine, is the French scientists Pierre Pelletier and Joseph Caventou, who extracted quinine from cinchona bark in 1820. I brought up this dispute mostly because one of the other contenders is Andrew Duncan Jr. He also supposedly isolated an alkaloid from the bark. So there's a bunch of different medical men and scientists who are trying to find the cure. And what I think is really interesting about this discovery was it was followed by an unprecedented circulation of malaria as a diagnostic category. So basically, once we isolated quinine, there was an increase in diagnosing malaria, particularly malaria, not just fevers. It was probably not because it was a new disease. We knew about it before. Malaria as a diagnosis was used prior to this, but it does indicate probably that it didn't solidify as a diagnostic category until about the 1820s. Or that quinine was used to diagnose diseases as malaria. So essentially, if a person took quinine and got better, then the physician probably said, this has to be malaria then because quinine fixed it. Again, if you'll let me put my academic hat on a little bit, I think it's really, really interesting because This is weird relationship with the disease in some respects. So you usually see a case of someone experiencing a disease. We collect the data about the disease, the symptoms, etc., and then we sort of create a cure for it. But quinine and malaria sort of have this overlapping story together. It's not as linear as you would assume it would be. In the mid-19th century, cinchona plants and seeds were transported from South America to Dutch Java, French Algeria, and British India, establishing cinchona plantations. Historians have argued that putting the cure into these colonial interests redefined malaria as a colonial disease, even though it was evidenced in Europe, as we just said. And I would argue that this still persists. We see malaria more in these quote-unquote developing countries that were ex-colonies. That's the word I'm looking for. And I think other Americans might disagree with that because malaria is quite prevalent in places in America, such as Florida. Cinchona plants and quinine remained commercially significant into the interwar period, important both in public health and global politics. But as the 20th century moved on, the emphasis became less and less on producing cinchona and quinine and more on reducing the mosquito population. Because in 1897, Sir Ronald Ross, a British army surgeon, discovered that a particular type of mosquitoes were the insect vector of this disease. Historians have numbered quinine among the tools of colonialism because without it, European soldiers wouldn't have been able to conquer as much as they did. And historian Rohan Dub Roy has made the argument that, quote, the drug quinine and its source cinchona plants reinforced the ideological self-image of the British Empire as a simultaneously benevolent and profit-making enterprise because it was producing a cure for a disease, but also making loads of money from it. So people will know quinine from gin and tonics, potentially, and know the myth that British soldiers put gin in their quinine or powdered cinchona bark to make their medicine more palatable. I say it's a myth because it's probable that it wasn't just gin or only gin that they put in with the quinine. They probably also used rum and whiskey because that was also very prevalent at the time. And in fact, a lot of alcoholic drinks still have quinine in them. I'm just going to name a few: Campari, Pimm's, Lillet, which is a French aperitif, and Dubonnet, which is also French. But for those of you who aren't interested in alcohol, Iron Brew also has quinine in it. Finally, cinchona plants were sometimes referred to as fever trees, which listeners might know as a fancy tonic water you can buy in supermarkets today. Fever tree tonic water.
So, Olivia, what's your cue?
I'm sorry to do this to everyone, but my cue is quarantine.
We've had enough.
But it's quite a big topic, so I'm going to try and hit some of the highlights. As we all know, quarantine is a restriction on the movement of people, animals, and goods intended to prevent the spread of disease or pests. The term is often used in connection to disease and illness, restricting the movement of people who are exposed to a contagious disease to see if they become sick. These people may have been exposed to a disease and don't know it, or they might have the disease but don't show the symptoms. Quarantine is distinct from the concept of medical isolation, in which those confirmed to be infected with a communicable disease are isolated from a healthy population, although the two terms are often blurred. For example, you should quarantine and stay away from other people when you've been in close contact with someone who's sick, but then you should isolate if you become sick too. Quarantine may be used interchangeably with the phrase cordon sanitaire. However, although the terms are related, cordon sanitaire refers to the restriction of movement of people into or out of a defined geographic area, such as community, region, or country. Quarantining has roots in ancient public health practices, but it became more formalized and recognized as a vital public health measure in the Middle Ages. The word quarantine actually dates from the 14th century and the time of the plague. Venice took the lead in measures to check the spread of plague, having appointed 3 guardians of public health in the first years of the Black Death. And during an outbreak in 1377, officials in the Venetian-controlled port city of Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik in Croatia, passed a law establishing Trentino, a 30-day period of isolation for ships arriving from plague-infested areas. Within a century, the concept had spread to other port cities, and the isolation period had been extended from 30 to 40 days, or 40 giorni in Italian. It's not known precisely why the isolation period was extended to 40 days, but there's a lot of cultural and religious meaning behind the number 40. Plenty of biblical events draw upon the number, such as Jesus' fast in the desert, Moses' time on Mount Sinai, and the Christian observation of Lent. It may also have been changed because of the ancient Greek doctrine of critical days that teaches contagious diseases develop within 40 days after the initial exposure. According to current estimates, the bubonic plague had a 37-day period from infection to death. Therefore, European quarantines would have been highly successful. Island quarantines have historically been used as an effective method to control the spread of infectious diseases, particularly in times before the development of modern medicine, because of their natural isolation from mainland populations. They could be used to quarantine ships, travellers, or entire communities, as was the case with island leper colonies. Leprosy is a highly stigmatized disease that was feared for its contagiousness and disfiguring effects. The practice of quarantining people with leprosy dates back to ancient times, but in the Middle Ages, people with leprosy were marked with bells or distinctive clothing and were forced to live in lazar houses, named for Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers. Some societies used remote islands to segregate sufferers from the rest of the population, often resulting in social exclusion. Some examples include the Hawaiian island of Molokai, the Greek island of Spinalonga, and Lazaretto Nuovo in Venice. In Scotland, Inchkeith Island in the Firth of Forth has served as a quarantine site for many different diseases. In the 15th century, it was used as an isolated retreat for sufferers of Grand Gore, an Old Scots name for syphilis. The Grand Gore Act of 1497 led town councils in Scotland to set up quarantines so that people could isolate until their symptoms passed. Inchkeith was made a place of compulsory refuge for those suffering from the disease in Edinburgh, who were told to board a ship at Leith and remain on the island until God provided for their health. Generally, quarantine measures have evolved alongside an understanding of disease transmission, with important historical milestones reflecting both local and global concerns about contagious diseases. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Scotland, much like Europe, was periodically struck by outbreaks of bubonic plague. Particularly Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Aberdeen all experienced several plague outbreaks, and in response, the local authorities adopted rudimentary quarantine measures to contain the spread. For example, in 1645, Edinburgh was particularly badly struck by an epidemic of bubonic and pneumonic plague. Those infected were transported by cart out of the more populated areas of Edinburgh and deposited outside the city walls by vrouwklingers, which is really fun to say, employed by the city. These vrouwklingers were responsible for cleaning an infected person's house and belongings, transporting sufferers to quarantine zones, and burying the bodies of those that died. The clangers also enforced strict quarantine rules, including punishment for concealment of plague symptoms within your household, the theft of infected persons' belongings, or visiting a plague sufferer's house. And I got all of that information from one of the stops on the RCP walking tour. The cholera pandemics of the 19th century, particularly the first wave in the 1830s, led to more systematic approaches to quarantine. Cholera is a bacterial infection often spread through contaminated water and food, and its rapid spread through urban populations led to heightened fears and stronger public health measures. In Scotland, cholera outbreaks prompted local authorities to impose quarantine measures again, such as isolating cholera patients in their homes, setting up cholera hospitals in isolated areas. The importance of clean water and sanitation became more apparent, but quarantine still played a role in containing the spread. Quarantine stations were again established in several Scottish ports, and ships arriving from regions affected by cholera or other infectious diseases were required to undergo inspection and isolation before allowing passengers to disembark. Quarantine measures became more formalised in the UK with the Contagious Diseases Act in 1864, and later revisions provided clearer protocols for quarantine measures during outbreaks of disease including smallpox, typhus, and yellow fever. The Spanish flu pandemic in the aftermath of World War I had a major impact on public health policies worldwide. And while quarantine measures were used to control the spread, the scale of the pandemic made them difficult to enforce. And as a result, much of the response focused on social distancing, mask wearing, and the closure of public spaces. In the mid-20th century, with the development of vaccines, diseases like smallpox were brought under control, leading to a gradual decline in the need for quarantine measures in some parts of the world. But obviously, as we all know, since 2020, quarantine has been effectively used again and is now seen as one part of a larger public health strategy that includes vaccination, isolation, testing, and contact tracing.
So plague wasn't actually super common in Scotland like it was in other places in Europe. Like there were quarantine measures and it did affect us. I wasn't here to some extent. It was often referred to as the English disease, like in the same way that syphilis was eventually called the English disease, because it was the English people, the English traders that were bringing over this plague. And also in that 1645 epidemic that you were talking about, the University of Edinburgh shipped all of their students out of Edinburgh into Linlithgow, and that was far enough away that they were essentially quarantined in another part of Scotland, which I find really interesting.
Oh, they chose Linlithgow with
Yeah.
their students. Interesting.
At that time, it was so far away from Edinburgh. That was considered far enough away.
It's for anyone that doesn't know, it's like the first stop after Edinburgh on the train line between Edinburgh and Glasgow.
So my cue is quackery. And I'm looking at a very specific example of quackery. I'm looking at the German doctor Franz Mesmer. So, and you know, it may sound familiar, Mesmer of mesmerism fame. In 1770s Vienna, Mesmer began a quite remarkable con because he was selling a product, a miraculous healing product, but this product is invisible. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it, but it exists, according to Mesmer. He calls it animal magnetism. So this product, this medical product, is a part of Mesmer's body. It is something which is innate within his body. Not everybody has animal magnetism, but those people who do could cure the sick. So according to Mesmer, some people who were capable of this magnetism had a very specific ability, so they could cure a specific disease. So this guy is the magnetizer of genital warts. This guy over here is the magnetizer of hemorrhoids. This guy is the magnetizer of gout. But he was the greatest magnetizer of all. He, Mesmer, could treat almost every ailment with his special magnetism. And he did this by transmitting the magnetism from his body into that of his patient. And this created what he called a crisis. And a crisis was the moment when a patient, they would shiver, they would shake, their teeth would chatter, they would struggle to be able to breathe. You would be able to see a patient, who was in this crisis. It would be visible on their body, they're shaking, they're chattering, and so on. And you would have to undergo a series of these treatment sessions, quite pricey treatment sessions, and over time, as you were repeatedly magnetized and you repeatedly experienced this bodily crisis, your natural balance would be restored and you would be healed of your hemorrhoids, genital warts, whatever it was. So, unlike other types of quacks, Mesmer wasn't adding to an existing medical system. He wasn't creating a new, medicine within the understanding of what medicine was. He was creating a whole new field of medicine. This was something which he just sort of pulled out of nowhere almost. And so alongside this new type of medicine, there is a whole new field of terminology. Obviously, in order to make it sound scientific, to make it sound rigorous, you need words, ideally words that sound a bit Latin, that sounds proper to people who are, ready to be impressed. So as well as animal magnetism, you have fluidium. So fluidium is an invisible but powerful force which connects every person to the entire universe, according to Mesmer. And he didn't stop with that. He also developed a whole range of specialist tools. So there were strange-looking mirrors, there were special conductors, there were wands, there were all these objects that you needed. What Mesmer was doing is a bit like a MLM, multi-level marketing, because not only is he doing this to patients, but he's also selling products to other mesmerizers. He's saying, in order for you to be able to do this yourself, you have to buy from me the special mirror, the special wand, whatever. So yes, he's selling a con to the con men as well as to the patients. So because this is new, this is obviously quite exciting. So people, sort of particularly middle-class people, are quite intrigued by this. The late 1700s is a time when there is increasing consumerism, increasing disposable income, not for everybody, but for that sort of middle class. So Mesmer quite quickly develops quite an extensive client list, and he's quite popular amongst these upper middle class and upper class women in particular. Bored aristocrats, bored upper middle class, stay-at-home housewives. The medical community were a bit less impressed. So the bored rich women might have been into it. The medical community a bit less so. He got quite a lot of quite strong backlash. So much so that he ended up leaving Vienna in 1777 and moving instead to Paris. And he had an idea that if Vienna didn't want him, or if the medical community in Vienna were so against him, perhaps Paris would be better. That didn't quite work out. The Parisian scientific community were even less supportive than they had been in Vienna, because not only were medical professionals skeptical, but the French authorities were also quite hostile towards him. Paris at this time was really a hotbed of revolutionary agitation. Any new developments, any new ideas which could be seen as potentially destabilizing the status quo were viewed as quite suspicious. And as a result of this, in 1784, King Louis XVI appointed a scientific commission to examine the efficacy of Mesmer's treatment. So they were not just going to accept what he was doing, they were going to scientifically study what Mesmer claimed was happening. And the commission that was set up was actually led by Benjamin Franklin. So, longtime scientist, more recently one of the founding fathers of the US, but he was in Paris as a diplomat. He was the United States' first ambassador to France. So he was an existing scientist already interested in medicine, and he happened to be in Paris anyway because of his political role. So he was a key part of this commission, and there were various other prominent physicians, chemists, mathematicians. So this wasn't a half-hearted commission. They were taking this quite seriously. They were really going to dig into Mesmer and his theories. And there was a couple of decisions they made at the outset that were very important. One of which was they were going to completely disregard the theorizing of Mesmer and the theorizing of his followers. Anything that was an untestable hypothesis that they were just verbally told, they said, and this is a quote, was immaterial and superfluous. So that had nothing to do with what they were doing. Instead, it was going to be, their findings were going to be entirely based on controlled experiments. And so using human subjects, they would test the effect of Mesmer's magnetism. So they started out by attending a couple of the Mesmer and his followers who, part of the MLM, their group sessions. So they would often have group magnetism sessions, partially because they could get a lot more money by not doing these things one-on-one. But the commission quickly realized that this was not a good way to test things because there were so many uncontrolled variables, and it was very obvious that the patients, the attendees, were feeding off one another. So if one person had a crisis, then it was a snowball effect and everyone would end up responding. So people were feeding off other people and perhaps unconsciously just sort of picking up on other people's reactions. So instead, their tests were one-on-one. They were going to test individual people. Now, and this is the bit where I start slightly disagreeing with them. They separated the people they were testing into two groups. The groups were called the commoners and high society. And they believed, the commission believed that people who were commoners were more likely to fake a response, to kind of have visible reaction. And their reasoning was that these commoners, as they called them, would be overwhelmed by being in the presence of gentlemen such as them. And so they would do whatever they thought they wanted. So they were like, they will be so overawed to be in the room with Benjamin Franklin that they're just going to have a reaction to that Benjamin Franklin will be impressed by them and want to be their mate or something. So I'm not fully convinced that the class division would work in quite that way. But they said that, this is a quote, individuals chosen from high society could not be suspected of ulterior motives, and intelligence would permit them to discuss their own sensations and report on them accurately. So the idea that if you're rich and posh, you would never have an ulterior motive, I'm unconvinced. So they did a whole series of experiments. So, for example, they sat a woman beside a closed door and told her that on the other side of that door, there was a doctor who was mesmerizing her. And of course, there's nobody there. She is not being mesmerized. This is not happening. But once the person had been told that someone was mesmerizing, they would have a crisis quite often, regardless of what was actually happening on the other side of the door. Another example was they were magnetizing a woman, and whatever part of her body was supposedly being magnetized, she would feel a burning sensation. They then blindfolded her and told her that they were doing this magnetizing. And her response was exactly the same, even though when she was blindfolded, some of the time nothing was happening. So her response was exactly the same, regardless of whether it was happening or not, as long as she was being told that it was being done to her. And they did exactly the same in reverse, where they had someone who was magnetizing her, but they didn't tell her, and she didn't register that she was being magnetized because no one had verbally told her that this was happening. So essentially, the results are exactly what you would have thought. As long as the person was told that they were being magnetized, they felt magnetized. If they weren't being told they were being magnetized, they didn't feel it. So that's essentially their findings. The ultimate finding of the commission, again, this is a quote, was, quote, magnetism did not produce any noticeable effects on those who were skeptical. So if you didn't believe in it, you didn't feel it. If you did believe in it and you were told it were happening, you did feel it. They produced over 20,000 copies of the report of their findings. They were very widely distributed, and of course, as a result, Mesmer's reputation nosedived. People were not really willing to be associated with him. He was quite widely ridiculed in the press. The Paris Faculty of Medicine expelled anyone who was a supporter of animal magnetism. So at that point, Mesmer, his career was essentially ruined. He left Paris, he moved to Switzerland, and he basically just sort of lived there quietly for the rest of his life.
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.